Scahill is an investigative journalist. This comes right out of Wikipedia. Scahill. You know that I pasted that out of there?
Say whatever you want about me, but get my name right.
I'm sorry, Jerry Scahill. I've been doing that for a week, by the way. Is an investigative journalist and author whose book focuses on the use of private military companies, so-called private contractors. He is the author of the best-selling book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, which was the winner of a George Polk Book Award. He also serves as correspondent for the radio and TV program Democracy Now! David, which many of us know and cherish and depend upon as an alternate source of information. The Church of Democracy Now! And Scahill is also a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute and a frequent contributor to the Nation. And so, dear brothers and sisters, give a warm and loud welcome to Jeremy Scahill.
And thank you to all of the activists that made this gathering possible and who are constantly representing Brooklyn in a very strong way and pushing for a peace agenda. It's a very much an uphill battle, but if it's to be won, it's in small communities across this country and groups like this that gather together and refuse to be a part of a war machine that is increasingly being unleashed in countries away from media attention and anything even vaguely resembling effective congressional oversight. I've spent pretty much the past decade traveling in and out of U.S. war zones. I started going to Iraq in the mid-1990s, and after 9/11, at the time I was living in Belgrade. At the time the country was called Yugoslavia. Now it's Serbia. I was living in Belgrade because I had been covering the downfall of the regime of Slobodan Milosevic and the NATO war, the US-led NATO war in the Serbian province of Kosovo. And when 9/11 happened, I was in Belgrade, and I remember thinking as I watched the towers falling and then the Pentagon burning that they were going to attack Iraq. And it wasn't some Nostradamus prediction on my part. It was pretty clear to people who had been paying attention to the agenda of the neocons throughout the 1990s that they were agitating for regime change in Iraq. In fact, they came into power. People like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and Douglas Feith and Paul Wolfowitz and Stephen Cambone. These guys spent the entire duration of the 90s in the parallel government in this country. When Bill Clinton was in power, they were running a sort of shadow government that was preparing for the next time that they would come into power at the White House, and they were at the think tanks, or as Naomi Klein says, the people paid to think by the makers of tanks. So they're at these think tanks, and of course Dick Cheney, for part of the 1990s, was building up the Halliburton empire, which was particularly interesting because Cheney, when he was defense secretary under George H.W. Bush, one of the last things he did as defense secretary was to commission a study from a division of Halliburton on how to privatize as much of the military bureaucracy as possible. And the idea, and it was quite brilliant on Cheney's part, was that you can kind of get a 2-for-1. When you outsource as much of the military bureaucracy as possible, you free up more of the men and women in uniform to do the fighting of your wars, and it enables you to fight more wars, small and large, simultaneously. But it also creates an incredible pool of U.S. taxpayer-funded payoffs to huge corporations. And those corporations, in turn, will then take some of their profits and pour them back into the U.S. campaign finance machine, which is essentially a corporate ATM that is funded by U.S. taxpayers. And there's a direct relationship between the wars that we've seen waged throughout these decades, really, but certainly over the past 10 years, and the campaign finance system in this country. Many of the Democrats are completely bought by the defense industry. I mean, it's a misnomer. I mean, there's nothing defensive about it. We have an offensive war machine. We almost never have taken a defensive action. We're all in the business now of preemptive war and these so-called signature strikes, which is an insane name for a process of choosing targets for drones in Pakistan and now in Yemen, where you are not targeting an individual person. You're certainly not targeting anyone that's been accused of a crime in any court, or has been brought up on any charges. But it's not even that we're targeting, that the U.S. is targeting individuals anymore in these surgical strikes. They're doing a pattern of life analysis. And what they're saying is that if this person was known to attend this mosque, and then they were at a gathering with a large group of people, and we know that they met with X, Y, and Z over the course of the next 10 years, then it's safe to assume that that person is a terrorist. We don't have any actual evidence on that person, but the CIA is now authorized through drone surveillance to determine patterns of life for individual people or groups of people in Yemen and in Pakistan, and then determine that those people are legitimate military targets to be taken out. And those kinds of strikes are called signature strikes, rather than the sort of high-value target intentional strike where you're trying to hit an individual person. That's how far it's come. And you hear not a peep from anyone in the Congress. When it was first revealed in early 2010 that the United States government was maintaining a hit list that included U.S. citizens, Dennis Kucinich introduced a bill in the Congress. And that bill did not mention the name Anwar al-Awlaki. It didn't mention any specific names. It simply said that as a result of these news reports, that the United States government, the CIA, and the Joint Special Operations Command are operating some sort of a hit list that might include U.S. citizens. The Congress should clarify the law for the president. And what that resolution, it was just 1 page long, what it simply said was, the United States government does not have a right to assassinate its own citizens without due process. It seems simple enough. It seems consistent with the values I would imagine a majority of Americans believe that they hold and that this country is supposed to represent. 6 members of the House signed on to that bill with Dennis Kucinich, and not a single senator. This was not a pro-Anwar al-Awlaki bill. It didn't mention anything about Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It didn't talk about terrorists. It simply clarified that U.S. citizens cannot be assassinated by their own government without due process. And only 6 members of Congress would sign on to this with Congressman Dennis Kucinich. So with him out of Congress, the number of people that are the elected representatives of the people of this nation that actually will stand up for a sharp, clear peace agenda is almost non-existent right now. Remember how all of this started in the modern context. I mean, we could talk about the whole history of the United States, and it's completely riddled by episodes of mass violence and genocide and collective punishment and the prison industrial complex and and slavery and the targeting of Native Americans. But I'm going to confine my conversation on these wars to basically the past 12 years. Remember, though, how it got so far that in September and October of last year, in a 2-week period, 3 United States citizens were killed in drone strikes directly authorized by President Barack Obama in a 2-week period. Not a single one of those 3 American citizens was charged with any crime in a U.S. court. They were well known to the United States government. There were a lot of allegations being made against them. Some of them, in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, did the U.S. government a favor in terms of some of the rhetoric that he was engaging in on YouTube and elsewhere. But the rhetoric that Anwar al-Awlaki was engaging in is no more radical than what we hear white supremacist groups engage in the United States all the time, including in threatening directly the President of the United States. And yet, somehow, we as a nation have elected people who believe that secret lists for people that just need to die are acceptable. That we don't have to try our own citizens to give them the death penalty. That the President of the United States, and that's the real death panel. The Republicans like to talk about death panels. There is a death panel, but it's not about health care. The death panel is about killing American citizens with no due process whatsoever. So in this 2-week period, the President of the United States served as prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner against 3 U.S. citizens. And there has been almost no outrage expressed over those deaths whatsoever. Instead, you see an avalanche of people talking about how they deserved it. Harry Reid was on was the Senate Majority Leader, the leading Democrat. Harry Reid, 3 weeks ago, was on CNN. And Candy Crowley, the anchor on CNN, asked Harry Reid, what he thought about these 3 US citizens that had been killed in Yemen. And he said he wasn't going to get into classified information, but that those 3 people were terrorists who deserved to die. Now, you can make a case that Anwar al-Awlaki was espousing views that encouraged terrorist activity. That should be dealt with in a US court, if that's the case. If he violated a US law and he's a US citizen, that should be dealt with in a court. I'm not here to defend Anwar al-Awlaki's legacy. But how many of you are aware who the 3rd American citizen killed in that strike was? It was a 16-year-old boy named Abdurrahman al-Awlaki, whose only crime in the world appears to have been that his father was named Anwar al-Awlaki. He wasn't killed as collateral damage in the same strike as his father. His father was killed with another American citizen named Samir Khan, whose parents were Pakistani immigrants. The 2 of them were killed in late September. 2 weeks later, this boy, Abdurrahman al-Awlaki, had been in the family's village in Shebwa in Yemen, and he was there to help honor his father after he had died. And he was sitting with his 17-year-old cousin in an outdoor restaurant, and they were eating, and a drone came and fired a missile directly, hitting the restaurant where these teenage boys and others were eating dinner. The United States government has not given any explanation. Abdurrahman al-Awlaki was killed 198 days ago. The US government has provided no explanation for why that teenage American citizen was assassinated in a US drone strike authorized by the President of the United States. Originally, they tried to say that there was a terrorist that he was with named Ibrahim al-Bana, and that he was the target. Of course, they don't say this publicly, they leak it to the Washington Post, which is basically the receiving vehicle for CIA propaganda. So they leak this to the Washington Post, and they say, well, he was collateral damage, we were trying to kill Ibrahim al-Bana, but the real question is, what was he doing with Ibrahim al-Bana? Ibrahim al-Bana wasn't even there. Ibrahim al-Bana is still walking around Yemen. So who was the target in that strike that killed a 16-year-old citizen who was born in Colorado named Abdurrahman al-Awlaki? Where's the call from the State Department to his family to explain to him why this happened? One of the other Americans that was killed, Samir Khan, who I told you about. Samir Khan's crime was that he was the creator and editor, at least according to the press reports, of a pro-Al-Qaeda publication called Inspire magazine, which was an English-language, glossy, downloadable PDF magazine that published a dozen or so issues. Samir Khan's family started getting visits from the FBI in 2007 because Samir Khan, when he was still living in the US, was a blogger who was blogging against the wars. He was deeply affected by Abu Ghraib and the torture at Abu Ghraib. And he started blogging. And you can still go back and see. It's online, it's archived. He, like many people in this country, and not just Muslims, and not just Arabs, but like many people in this country, were outraged at these wars, the seeming endless nature of them, and the extent to which the US intelligence and military community would go to test new techniques of torture on people in secret prisons around the world and in known prisons in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Samir Khan then goes to Yemen to study Arabic, and he somehow gets involved with Anwar al-Awlaki. The FBI visits the Khan family, and they said, you know, are you in touch with Samir? We're concerned about some of the things that he's writing. We're concerned who he's with in Yemen. But they said repeatedly to the Khans that your son has not broken any laws that we know of, and that as far as we can tell, he's engaged in First Amendment protected activities. So Samir Khan is then killed in this US drone strike after multiple visits from the FBI telling his family that he was engaged in First Amendment protected activity, but they were concerned about who he was associating with. He wasn't indicted on any charges. He wasn't charged with any crime, and he's killed. The State Department calls the Khan family after that drone strike, and they said, we regret to inform you that your son has been killed in Yemen. And the family said, well, who killed him? Yeah. Well, we can't talk about that. So here you have 3 US citizens. One of them they probably could have brought up on charges, Anwar al-Awlaki, if they wanted to. I haven't seen evidence that has convinced me that he was an operational member of Al-Qaeda, but I can understand that there's enough in the public domain where it warranted an investigation. But you don't handle people that you find suspicious by just murdering them or ordering their execution. There's supposed to be due process. So Anwar, I interviewed people close to Al-Qaeda when I was just in Yemen. And they said, al-Awlaki wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda. He was a religious leader that we all respected. And he was definitely pro-Al-Qaeda, but he wasn't with us. He wasn't plotting these attacks. He wasn't teaching people how to fire. He looked like a donkey with a spoon when he was holding a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, like the man didn't know what he was doing. And yet suddenly, and it came as a great shock to his family and to Al-Qaeda in Yemen, suddenly President Obama, in announcing that he's killed Anwar al-Awlaki, says that he was the head of external operations for Al-Qaeda. All of a sudden he goes from being this guy who is an internet jihadist preacher to being the head of external operations for Al-Qaeda. And that came as a great shock to Al-Qaeda in Yemen because that wasn't the leadership structure they had on their internal papers. But the reason that I'm bringing all of this up is because if President Bush was doing this, if President Bush was in office, or if McCain had won, and you had the President of the United States declaring quite openly that he has every right to order the assassination of US citizens with no charges, there'd be a hell of a lot more outrage than there is right now. If President Bush was expanding drone attacks into Yemen with that nonsense about signature strikes, that you can somehow, from 30,000 feet in the air, develop a pattern of life for people, and then decide that they need to die the next day. If President Bush was doing that, there'd be a lot more outrage. There'd be a lot more members of Congress that would be at least making a little bit of noise about it. What we've seen happen over this first term of President Obama is that this president, who was elected on a pledge to radically change the way that the US was operating, that he has actually expanded many of the worst policies implemented by the Cheney presidency. He has expanded the US wars now into Somalia. We had the US involved with regime change in Libya. You have the US continuing to support dictatorships in Bahrain and Yemen. You have the United States continuing to bomb Pakistan. You have the Joint Special Operations Command and the CIA intensifying their attacks on Yemen. You have the crackdown on journalists and whistleblowers. This president has applied the Espionage Act against whistleblowers more than any president since the early 1900s. And this is the constitutional law professor. Who are the people that this administration is going after? Who are they targeting? They are targeting people like former CIA agent John Kiriakou, who blew the whistle on waterboarding. He was one of the sources that first started to reveal the extent to which Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had been waterboarded, 283 times. And he spoke out about the waterboarding. And you had Thomas Drake at the NSA who spoke out against the warrantless wiretapping that was going on and continues to go on. This administration came to power saying, we have to look forward, not backward. We are not going to prosecute the CIA torturers. Jose Rodriguez, who destroyed the CIA torture tapes, is going to be selling a book and making hundreds of thousands of dollars. He's going to be on 60 Minutes on Sunday night. He walks around a free man while the CIA people who blew the whistle on it are being prosecuted by this administration. The reality is that it sends a message, if you waterboard, we will protect you. But if you blow the whistle on waterboarding, we will prosecute you. That is what's happening. Journalists are being attacked. Surveillance operations are being conducted against journalists. National security letters are being served on internet providers so that journalist emails and activist emails and Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts, your information, if they have you in their crosshairs, can be handed over to the government, and it is against the law for your internet service provider to tell you that they've been served with those papers. They can face 5 years in prison simply for telling you that the government is now deeply into your email. This is not happening under a Republican administration. This is happening under a Democratic administration. What Barack Obama has done with his presidency is to normalize the unthinkable, to normalize policies that would have outraged and did outrage people in this country when they came to light. And he's normalizing it for millions of liberals in this country. We talk a lot about drones, and I'm going to be attending the drone summit in DC this evening. It's so much more than drones. We're using cruise missiles, we're using cluster bombs, we're using Spectre AC-130 gunships that can come in and just mow down people. When I was in Somalia, I traveled with CIA-backed warlords. The CIA has warlords in Somalia who are being paid to hunt down people that are suspected of being Islamist militants or connected to the movement Al-Shabaab, which is a radical Islamist movement inside of Somalia. When I flew into the airport in Mogadishu, I immediately saw a huge structure that looked to me like a forward operating base in open view at the airport in Mogadishu. And within 48 hours, I had confirmed that it was a new CIA base. I spoke to one of the heads of Somalia's intelligence service who liaises with the CIA. They have a training center there where they're training Somali kill-capture teams, and they're bankrolling warlords who are hunting down people throughout Somalia. When I called the CIA for comment, they confirmed that in fact, that was a CIA facility, and that in fact, they were paying these Somali agents. They were very, very concerned about us publishing that, but they did confirm that it was in fact accurate. I also reported on how the US has a secret prison buried in the basement of Somalia's National Security Agency that is staffed by, currently, under President Obama, in total violation of his own executive orders that he issued within days of taking office, when he stood in front of the original Constitution, copy of the Constitution, and talked about the rule of law, and then proceeded to violate it himself. There's a secret prison infested with bedbugs in the basement of Somalia's National Security Agency, where CIA and US military intelligence officials and French and British intelligence interrogate people that in some cases are snatched off the streets of countries other than Somalia and brought to this prison in Somalia. Does this sound familiar? Yes. One guy was taken out of the Somali neighborhood of Eastleigh in Nairobi, Kenya, was hooded, shackled, a diaper placed on him, taken to an airplane, flown from Nairobi into Mogadishu. He only knew he was in Mogadishu because of the smell of the sea. They then take him to a bedbug-infested prison and repeatedly interrogate him. No Red Cross. When I was on Democracy Now! With the Red Cross, I asked the Red Cross, the head of their Somalia office, about that prison. He said, we have no information on it. I said, well, are you going to follow up on it? And he goes, we wouldn't know where to even start. I said, well, you can just go into the airport in Mogadishu and you can walk over to the CIA base and ask them to take you to their prison. Because it's there and everyone knows about it and no one talks about it. And the CIA tries to pressure journalists not to talk about it. I know for a fact that several famous foreign correspondents knew about that prison before I did, and none of them printed it. And the question is why? This administration has raised the stakes for journalists who go up against US national security policy. They've raised the stakes for people who dare to interview those people that have been called terrorists or labeled terrorists by the United States government. The journalist I told you about who took the pictures of the US missile parts and gave them to Amnesty International and broadcast them on Al Jazeera around the world, he's in a secret prison right now in Yemen. He was prosecuted in a court that was set up to go after journalists who insulted the US-backed regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And he has been sentenced to prison for being an Al-Qaeda spokesperson. He worked with ABC News, he worked with the Washington Post, he worked with Al Jazeera. He was one of the most well-known independent journalists in Yemen. And you know why he's in prison right now? Because of one man, Barack Obama. Now you may say, well, how can you connect Obama to this? I'll tell you. On February 2nd, 2010, Barack Obama called Ali Abdullah Saleh. This is on the White House website, the readout of the call, and expressed concern about this journalist, Abdullah Haider Shaya. He knew that he had been held by the Yemeni government. He had been picked up multiple times. He was beaten and harassed, and the Yemeni government was going to release him. And Obama calls the president of Yemen and says that the US is very concerned about reports that you intend to pardon and release Abdullah Haider Shaya. And Ali Abdullah Saleh had a pardon on his desk that had been prepared by tribal mediators. He ripped it up. And that journalist remains in prison to this day because of one phone call from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Not from John Brennan, not from Hillary Clinton, from the President of the United States himself. That's how far the war on journalists has come. That we will keep foreign journalists in gulags in their own country. The world is a battlefield is a phrase that the neocons loved. It was on all their PowerPoint presentations. When Congress gave them the authority to wage war around the world, we crossed a threshold in this country. The designation of people as terrorists is done by fiat, not by evidence, not through anything resembling due process. Every country in the world is subject to potential action by the United States military special operations forces or by the CIA's Special Activities Division. If there's a person that we've identified as a terrorist that we decide needs to die, we have a drone to do it, or we can simply bomb their village with a cruise missile. The fact is that this president has doubled down on the very dangerous notion that the world is a battlefield, and that anyone we don't like, including those people that are our own citizens whose speech we don't like, that they somehow have a missile with their name on it, rather than an indictment with their name on it. It's the constitutional law expert that has taken us to a point now where it is codified as U.S. policy that Democrats and Republicans alike believe in assassination as a central part of the American identity when it comes to foreign policy. How incredibly dangerous the moment we're in now actually is. And it's people like you who have the audacity to say no in a culture of yes that are going to change this country. It's not about electoral politics. It's about preserving our own conscience and trying to spread these movements for peace and justice, regardless of if the person in power is someone we like or someone we despise. These are times that try your principles. Rise to the occasion. Thank you very much.